I'm the chairman of Stand Against Communism. Stand Against Communism is a group that was formed several months ago as we began to discuss with some of the experts on this subject what is happening in our country and the rise of socialism, and it's becoming mainstream. And we believe that there is more to this than meets the eye and that something needed to be done. One of the issues was whether we call ourselves Stand Against Socialism, but as you'll hear, we determined that socialism and communism are exactly the same, and that we will not allow euphemisms to lull us to sleep or make us think that this is some sort of wonderful social good that people are trying to do, but that this is an evil, nefarious, pernicious ideology that threatens the future of this nation. And so we wanted to come before you with some people who have been a part of this struggle for many, many years, are experts as part of Stand Against Communism, and we wanted you to hear from them so that you could hear firsthand some of the research that they've done, the information that they've uncovered, the books that they've written, the films that they've done, and we'll allow time at the end. I'll come back at the end for closing remarks, and we'll allow time after that for questions from the press. Our first speaker is Trevor Loudon. Now, we have biographies in the back for press people. If you want more extensive information on each speaker, we won't take the time to give their entire biographies. It would take up too much time. But Trevor Loudon is the author of Barack Obama and the Enemies Within, and the Enemies Within, Communists, Socialists, and Progressives in the United States Congress. Trevor Loudon.
Hi, it's good to see some familiar faces. Thank you, Bishop Jackson. The first press conference I ever did was in 2008 here in Washington, D.C. with Cliff Kincaid on Obama. And had you listened to us then, think of all the trouble you may have saved. So, look, a few years back, the AFL-CIO was militantly opposed to illegal immigration. It would take the jobs of American workers. It would lower wages and conditions. And you should have seen the speeches that Harry Reid and Bill Clinton used to make condemning illegal immigration in the most militant terms. Well, now it's the opposite. So what changed? Well, in 1995, Democratic Socialists of America, your largest Marxist organization, took over the AFL-CIO under John Sweeney. They removed the anti-communist clause from the AFL-CIO's constitution, and those 70s and 60s radicals flooded into the union movement. And this altered the face of the Democratic Party beyond belief. The unions are the backbone of the Democratic Party, and the unions are now controlled by Marxists. In the last few years, you've had a huge upswing of Marxist infiltration into the Democratic Party. Four major groups: Communist Party USA, Democratic Socialists of America, Freedom Road Socialist Organization, and the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism, comprising about 60,000 members, have joined together in an organization they call the Left Inside-Outside Project, with the explicit purpose of infiltrating and taking over the Democratic Party all over the country. They are active in every precinct in every state of the country. They're taking over the Democratic Party from the lower levels up. In California right now, they're running over 100 Marxists for the Democratic Central Committee, including both of the leaders for the presidency of the California Democratic Party. The Communist Party is running candidates across the country. They ran 3 in Houston in the last election cycle on the Democratic ticket. One of them got 250,000 votes running as a Democrat. Another one ran as a Congress member. Another one ran for county commission in Houston. Freedom Road Socialist Organization, which is pro-Chinese, as is the Communist Party USA, as is Committee of Correspondence, are heavily involved in the races in Virginia through a group called New Virginia Majority, which has basically tipped that state blue. They elected the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, Chokwe Lumumba. They are now running Tammy Sawyer for the mayoralty of Memphis, one of America's biggest cities, and they're going to back Atticus Scott for the governorship of Kentucky in the next election. So what we're seeing is a general takeover of the grassroots of the Democratic Party. Now this has been reflected in Congress, obviously, because you have, what's power without people in the legislature? So you've got now people like the guy from the head of the Homeland Security Committee, Benny Thompson from Mississippi, who's the head of the Homeland Security Committee, very actively involved with the Communist Party as a young man, the pro-Chinese Communist Workers' Party, and very actively involved with Fidel Castro in Cuba to set up a scholarship program for young American communists to study medicine for free in Cuba. And that was done by the head of the Homeland Security Committee. Wow. Well, people say, well, look, this can't be happening because, the FBI would stop this, right? Well, the FBI answers to the Judiciary Committee. And the Judiciary Committee was headed for many years by a man called John Conyers, who had a 50-year history with the Communist Party USA, 40 years with Democratic Socialists of America, and 30 years with the Workers' World Party, which supports North Korea and Cuba and Iran. On that committee, you also have a woman called Judy Chu from California, who has been very actively involved with the Communist Workers' Party for many, many years, still works with former members of that group. And you should see Judy Chu go off on the FBI whenever they have the temerity to arrest one of the more than 25,000 Chinese spies currently operating in this country. You are racist, she says. You are picking on these people because you don't like Chinese. And she has arranged for sensitivity training for the FBI so they don't persecute these Chinese spies. And the head of that committee, Jerry Nadler, has been a member of Democratic Socialists of America for more than 30 years. So a Marxist heads the Judiciary Committee, which controls the FBI. Presidential candidates, Pete Buttigieg, the moderate, the nice guy in the bunch. His father was one of the leading Gramsciist scholars in the country, Gramsci being the theoretical leader of the Italian Communist Party, and he's cooperated heavily with Democratic Socialists of America. Virtually every single major Democratic contender in this race has some sort of Marxist pedigree. Kamala Harris, for instance, her father was a Marxist professor. Her boyfriend, the mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown, was a long-time Communist Party supporter. And her financial mentor, the man who's got her to where she is today, is a former leader of the League of Revolutionary Struggle, a Maoist group. So we're here to expose what we see as a massive Marxist infiltration of today's Democratic Party. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. There'll be an opportunity for questions afterwards. We have a limited amount of time today. Next, Diana West, the author of The Red Threat and American Betrayal.
Hey.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm very grateful to Bishop Jackson for this opportunity to announce that there still exists a threat to this republic from the ideology of Marx and Lenin. I'm talking about communism and socialism. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, these ideologies were supposed to be obsolete, history. But it was a history that the free world never fully exposed and judged to be evil, not on a par with its exposure and judgment of Nazism. In 2013, I published a book called American Betrayal, which examines the reasons why. In part, we flinched as a result of the great success of the communist infiltration of American institutions of power and influence, which we should recognize helped establish the bureaucracies of what we call the deep state today. There was and remains an institutional reluctance to know the truth about communism, especially because communist crimes depended on Western complicity. The covert communist infiltration of the federal government revved up during the President Franklin Roosevelt's administrations. Expert estimates now tally the number of Americans assisting Soviet intelligence agencies during the 1930s and 40s as exceeding 500. Not one Aldrich Ames, not two Rosenbergs, more than 500 Americans loyal to Stalin, and who knows how many loyal to the anti-American agenda of international socialism. This was a national security fiasco of a magnitude that has never entered national comprehension. Today, we are in the throes of another national security fiasco as we learn about cells inside the US government that have attempted to overturn the 2016 election and destroy the presidency of Donald Trump. What does one have to do with the other? I am here to inform you that the red thread of Marxist influence links these two fiascos into a continuing crisis. I recently published a short book called The Red Thread, A Search for Ideological Drivers Inside the Anti-Trump Conspiracy, to lay out some of the facts. Here are a few. Consider Nellie Orr, a Russian expert, former professor and CIA contractor at Fusion GPS, the shop that produced the DNC and Clinton campaign document known as the Steele dossier. I learned by reading Nellie Orr's own writings that she harbors a kind of nostalgia for the Stalin era. In academic book reviews, Nellie Orr discusses her frustration in conveying to students, quote, the terror and excitement of the Stalin era. Excitement. She also talks about, quote, the agonizing paradoxes of the Stalinist state. Let me read one line from one of her reviews. This is Nellie Orr. One must commend this book's attempt to account for the agonizing paradoxes of the Stalinist state, one which was building a legal structure, yet tortured and executed innocent civilians. Oh, those agonizing paradoxes. From Nellie Orr, Stalin nostalgist, I will turn to Orr's Fusion GPS colleague, Christopher Steele, the former British intelligence officer. He was described as a confirmed socialist while at Cambridge in the 1980s with some undetermined association with the Marxist-influenced Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Also in the 1980s, we have former FBI Director James Comey and College of William and Mary. There, as Comey himself has said, he was a communist. While a communist college student, Comey developed his lifelong affinity for Reinhold Niebuhr, the theologian who was once well known for pro-Soviet militant socialist activism. To add to this rosy red picture, at around the same time, up the road in Langley, Virginia, we have John Brennan beginning his career at the CIA. Brennan told an audience in 2016 that in 1976, the candidate he voted for President of the United States was the Soviet Union's man in America, Communist Party leader Gus Hall. He also said he told the CIA this and was hired anyway, which says a lot about the recklessness of our intelligence community going back at least 40 years. This is just a little bit of the red thread of ideology running through the anti-Trump conspiracy. Americans have long been conditioned to ignore these ideological threats within, but we ignore them at our unimagined peril. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And next we'll hear from someone who escaped the clutches of the special counsel. It's an amazing story how the special counsel tried to force him to plead guilty to something he did not do. And when the special counsel finally folded up, there were no charges. And I say prosecutors, having practiced law for 15 years, prosecutors are supposed to seek justice, not put notches in their belt for people that they've convicted wrongly. Well, thank God that Jerome Corsi and his lovely wife stood up and said, no, we're not pleading guilty to something I didn't do. And ultimately, of course, the whole thing went away. Folks, a hero for our country.
Thank you all. Thank you for that generous, kind introduction. Rather than go through the history, I want to make one point on communism, and that was that in the 1950s in Hawaii, the Communist Party decided the best way to turn America communist was to penetrate the Democratic Party. And it was a conscious effort. There are hearings in which it's openly discussed. The conclusion coming out of World War II was the United States was not going to have a classic Marxist revolution. And the whole theory of class warfare was really a fiction, a fabrication. It wasn't going to happen that way. But rather, another path was going to be taken. I want to focus today, in this time, on trying to explain something that I think is fundamental, and that is, what is the appeal of communism? Because it's amazing that this essentially lie can and has populated so many minds and is currently in the process of capturing the youth of America in our universities. Those who have lived under communism know the truth of communism, but it's very hard to explain. When I was at Harvard in the 1970s getting my PhD, John Rawls, who was a philosophy professor, developed a theory of justice as fairness. Okay, now this was revolutionary because what he was trying to argue is that social injustices, which is, for instance, inequality of income, racial inequality, various inequalities which we as a nation have addressed and continue to address, can be resolved through a society which redistributes income, which has centralized control, and in fact, it's the only way you'll achieve justice is fairness. Now, in terms of classical political philosophy, Plato, Socrates, discussions in Plato's writings, Aristotle, it was never assumed that justice would be fairness. That was equality, it was not fairness. See, the fundamental aspect, this is one of the defects that we're going to have to address, because classical political theory acknowledges that there is no fairness in life. Okay, we don't all live the same amount of time. We're not all born equally to rich parents. We don't all find ourselves coming into the world in nations which are at peace, where we can thrive. The human situation is inherently unequal and unfair. God never said it would be fair. What God said was that this was an opportunity not to experience utopia or a perfect situation where everyone would have everything they wanted, as Marx would say, everyone working to their maximum to produce the good for all, and everyone would live happily thereafter. It doesn't happen. Classical political theory realizes that there is inequities, that life is not fair, and that we're going to spend most of our time fighting government, because governments inherently grab power, lie, and form tyrannies. And what our founding fathers were most concerned about was not to make America fair. Slavery was there. They couldn't eliminate slavery when the Constitution was written. But what they knew was that they had to preserve liberty, the First Amendment, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. And of the founders who recognized the sin and the horror of slavery, they realized it was going to take another second revolution in order to solve the problem, and it did. Abraham Lincoln did not start fighting the Civil War to end slavery, but he finished it up to end slavery. And he knew from the beginning that this was a great sin and crime that had to be eliminated. We're constantly going to have to deal in society with sins and crimes and problems. Life is problems. Your children are born, you've got to educate them. They misbehave, you've got to correct them. The human situation, which classically, in terms of biblical teaching, we are a fallen race. Original sin, and that's the fundamental condition. Communism comes on, and our students are being taught in universities of social justice. Not to say anything that offends anyone. That communism cannot exist without causing conflict. This was one of the fundamental Saul Alinsky principles, that you have to have somebody to oppose. You have to create enemies. And currently we are the enemies. Anyone believing in Jesus Christ, anyone believing in America, in terms of its constitution, we are the enemies. Evil in these people's minds, because we don't aspire to create this perfect world of social justice in which all people are going to be treated equally and fairly. And while those are noble principles that we should all aspire to, we should all fight injustice, we are never as human beings going to eliminate injustice. We're never as human beings going to eliminate these problems. What I'm telling you is that the fundamental appeal of communism is its psychological packaging. And this very powerful psychological packaging, which to most minds hearing it, I always said students in their first year at college should read the Communist Manifesto in order to really be indoctrinated, and then following that, read the Constitution and begin seeing why the Constitution exists and why it exists, fighting this error that we can have a utopia on earth. If we do not understand the psychological appeal of communism and how it infects minds, what happens with, as soon as these people get in control, now they've got power, their enemies are destroyed, the people who support them are among the first to go to the concentration camp. They grab all the power for themselves, and it's a formula which produces maximum injustice, maximum inequality. Everyone's poor, everyone's enslaved. But if we do not fight the psychological appeal of communism, we're not going to win. The world will go communist, and the consequences of that will probably be World War III. And that's what we have to prevent. So thank you all for being here today, and I'll be happy to be answering questions.
And now we have Robert Knight, longtime journalist, champion for the First Amendment rights for the Washington Times. Robert?
Thank you, Bishop, and thank you for organizing this. This is very important we get the word out. Now, the first rule of any Marxist revolution is that rules are fine if they advance the cause or cripple the cause's opponents, which is part of advancing the revolution, but they can be discarded the minute they get in the way. That's the way America's Marxists, Socialists, and many liberals have operated when it comes to the Constitution, especially the First Amendment. Here's the relevant portion of the actual text. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. When they were eager to legalize pornography and obscenity and destroy community standards, the left's attorneys, spearheaded by the ACLU, emphasized a no exceptions view. What the founders intended as protections for ideas, the ACLU turned into a get out of jail free card for pornographers, even for people who possess child pornography. Did you know the ACLU is against any laws of convicting people for possession of child pornography? They say, oh, once it's produced, it's okay. They're against producing it, they say, but they're not against creating the market for it. But how dare anyone anywhere restrict speech? It would be unconstitutional, they say. So, now the left has abandoned its earlier stance in favor of no-holds-barred First Amendment freedoms. Even the ACLU does come down on the right side occasionally, but all too often they ignore blatant suppression of speech, especially speech involving the pro-life movement or those defending marriage and family. They've also redefined civil rights. They've moved beyond immutable characteristics like skin color or actual constitutional protection accorded to religion in the First Amendment. They've expanded it to include volitional behavior that has moral implications. This is totally different from the original conception of civil rights. In doing so, they've transformed civil rights into a battering ram against morality. Now, we've heard about communist infiltration of America's campuses, but what about the newsrooms, since we're at the press club? Right now, they're full of people who honestly believe America needs to be taken down and replaced with a socialist, pansexual, entirely secular regime that brooks no dissent. Studies abound about the media's leftist bias, but all you have to do is switch on CNN or pick up the Washington Post. Here's a classic example. This is about a nun who was the president emeritus of a 220-year-old Catholic preparatory school, who wrote a letter saying, hey, we ought to include same-sex announcements in the alumni magazine. Totally against Catholic doctrine, totally against Christian views of sexuality. Here's the run-over headline the Post chose. Nun chooses love over church doctrine. Now quote Marx, that's the Post editors talking. They honestly believe that whatever the church says about sex and marriage is just a matter of hate. It's the opposite of love. Now, from Marx and Engels on, the destruction of the two pillars of society, family and church, have been a core mission. This mission became central in the mid-20th century because the workers of the world didn't rise up and unite in terms of economic upheaval. So Antonio Gramsci, who was mentioned earlier, Herbert Marcuse of the Frankfurt School, all saw that a sexual revolution, including educational indoctrination and media propaganda, could lead to political revolution. And that's why the left has embraced pornography, abortion, homosexuality, same-sex marriage, and now transgenderism. Failure to embrace any part of this singles you out for punishment. It all works against a family-based culture whose members are not as likely to fall for the left's siren song of forced redistribution. Strong families produce strong, independent people. As families weaken, so does the church, where families are part of the foundation, and where people learn a different gospel from that of Karl Marx. I can't read that. What's that say? It's so light. 1 minute left? Whoa, okay. Okay, one of the most effective tactics of the left is to coin new words, seize control of the language, and then use it to criminalize opposition. That's why abortion became choice. Reparative therapy for people with unwanted homosexual inclinations has been recast as conversion therapy, which conjures up images of electric shock and techniques that they don't use. They just sit down and talk with people. The Equality Act, which Democrats just passed in the House on Friday, is a motherlode of politically correct usage that can be turned into tools of persecution of Christians and others who won't go along with the left's ever-shifting sexual regime. Now, how did the media get so dominated by the Marxist mindset? Easy. They weed out anybody who disagrees with it. And they have a steady supply of young journalists fresh out of college where they've been brainwashed by Marxist professors. When I was an editor at the Los Angeles Times, I saw a difference in the 7 years I worked there. The interns came in reliably liberal, but by the time I left, they were outright activists who thought balancing a story with both sides was a betrayal of their calling. In most newsrooms, there are no enemies to the left. In fact, 3 of the full-time staff members in the Times Orange County newsroom, in which I worked, had worked for the New China News Agency. That's the English-language Communist Party newspaper. They didn't have any problem with that. Meanwhile, I hit a ceiling when my leftist boss found out I'd written an article for National Review magazine. When I told her that the Times staffers had written for many leftist publications, such as Mother Jones and Ramparts, she said, that's different. So I asked, how is it different? And she glared at me and said, it just is. Freedom of the press is great, but only as long as the press marches to the left. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And now the next speaker we hear before I come back for closing remarks is Nelson Velez. He's chairman of the Virginia Tea Party Federation, a businessman, and actually lived in Cuba.
It's a real pleasure to be living in this country. It really is. I have a real intimate, undying, abiding love for this country. And what you find interesting is that the people who come here legally from communist countries are more adept to understanding freedom than the people who are native born to this country now. It is stunning. You just ask people from Cuba. You ask people now that are leaving Venezuela how they feel about socialism, how they feel about communism. How do they feel about Chavez and what's happened since then. How do they feel about when Sean Penn came to visit to celebrate Chavez and his socialism, communism? And by the way, Chavez was elected. He was duly elected in Venezuela. Venezuela was prosperous, one of the most prosperous states. And yet he, as a socialist Democrat, was duly elected by free people. Now that free people in 2012 was disarmed, and now they're being run over by tanks. I can tell you, when I was in Cuba, I was very young. I was a teenager, and I went to this place called the Cuban Village. And I went there to become a warrior, to learn how to fight, and also to play the Spanish guitar. So for a young boy, what a combination. It was pretty cool. But afterwards, after the lessons, I was privileged to go to where these guys went. They were old guys. I mean, some of them were in their late 40s and 50s. So, the stories. Now, this place was a cabana, and it had a roof, and it had mostly walls. There were plenty of walls, majority walls, but it was big, and it had great food, and it had music, dance floors, big bar, and everything. And all the Cubans came in and talked about Cuban life. The casinos, the partying, the rich, the famous, the young, and the restless coming in from all over the world to Cuba for decades. They were the mecca of Latin America. It's wonderful, beautiful, prosperous. They had a great nightlife. They had great environment for businesses. They had all these things, including the mafia. The mafias are smart. They don't go to Mongolia. They go where the money was, and the money was in Cuba. Cuba was a wonderful place, made some money. In 1957, they told me, 1957, Cuba was more prosperous that year than any time before, and of course, any time since. And so how did this person, this young, dynamic, articulate person coming down from Sierra Madres, how did he captivate not only the Cuban people, but the world? How did he do that? It was a prosperous country. He was dynamic, and he was not into details. He talked about hope and change. Didn't talk about how to change or change to what. But he did say he was going to take care of corruption. That was the number one thing. And the other thing is that the big thing was that he was against communism over and over and over again. He says, you know what? I can tell you truthfully, I'm against dictatorships. I hate dictatorships. 2, I hate hatred. I hate the class warfare. I like to keep Cubans together, not apart. That was a big thing. And the third thing was communism is against God and against the church. And certainly against, I love the church and God. These are fundamental, foundational principles, and he betrayed every single one. And the reason he was successful was because he lied. And the reason that the lies were successful was because he presented this to the American media, and the American media laundered his information, laundered the fact that he was surrounded by communist infiltrators and his own violent past, and they vouched for him. They gave him legitimacy. And because of that, both Fidel Castro and Raul Castro had said over and over again publicly that without the American press, they would not be able to go and win the revolution because they didn't do it by arms. There were no dozens of hundreds of people dead. They had maybe a couple of dozen people that died during the whole campaign. But they could not do it through military means. They had to do it by propaganda and by the money that came in from Florida from anti-Batista so that they can pay off the military over there. So I just want to tell you that I'm very glad to be here. And I bless all of you, and I hope that in the generations to come, they will enjoy the Republic as we do now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelson. Just a few remarks, and then we'll open it up for questions. You know, when I was in my first year of college, a lot of my classmates walked around with Mao Zedong's little red book. And I had one. Now, I didn't take it that seriously, but apparently some people did. And it wasn't until I read Diana West's book that I found out that I can't believe it, but James Comey actually said that he was a communist. No, it's not some accusation somebody's thrown out. He's actually said it to a reporter in a New York Post interview. He said, I was a communist. He said, well, I don't know what I am now, but I was a communist. How does a former communist end up as head of the FBI? And that John Brennan actually voted for Gus Hall for president the first time he voted for president, and Gus Hall was being funded by the Soviet Union. How does the head of the CIA be a person who once voted for a communist to be president of the United States? And when somebody like that stands up and calls President Trump a traitor, I think, talk about a case of projection. That's got to be one. Well, folks, I got saved in 1976, and my attitude about this country was revolutionized. Because I came to realize something. America is one of the greatest gifts that God has ever given mankind. Yeah. Because no matter what they say, and of course we know that we're not a perfect country. We never have been, we never will be, because we're not perfect people. But no matter what they say, we have done more to help more people, not only in this nation, but around the world, than any other nation that's ever existed on the face of the earth. We have raised the standard of living.
Hear, hear.
For more people. And yes, I really do believe that this effort to undermine these foundational principles is very real, because you've got to separate America from certain things in order to fundamentally transform her. And one of the things you've got to separate America from is our history. Pete Buttigieg just recently said that we've got to remove Thomas Jefferson from all monuments. We've got to remove his name. Why would we remove his name? I guess because he was a slave owner. But what the left doesn't tell people is that the whole world was steeped in slavery. America didn't invent it, but America got rid of it. And that man that he wants out of our history is the man who wrote the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Yeah. Now, folks, my great-grandparents were slaves in Virginia, Gabriel and Eliza Jackson. But because of those words, and because of what our founding fathers believed and what they set in motion, their great-grandson can stand before you in the freest nation that's ever existed in history and speak my own mind as a free citizen of the United States of America. And you want to get rid of that? And you want to transform our culture? You want to change all the definitions? And folks, this is an amazing thing that we're watching, but we're actually watching the vocabulary be twisted as if it were 1984, where then evil is good, good is evil, light is darkness, darkness is light. And we have to be aware of the fact that just because you call it social justice, just because you use the word socialism, does not really change what you really have in mind. And folks, as a result of listening to Trevor and reading his materials and reading Diana's book and the research I've done, there is no difference between socialism and communism. When Bernie Sanders stands up and declares himself a socialist, we ought to all hear him saying, "I am a communist." Because that's exactly what it boils down to. I mean, Mao Zedong, of course, remember, he was Anita Dunn's, Barack Obama's communications director. He was one of the people she turned to when she needed advice and counsel. This vicious, brutal killer who executed probably or was responsible for the deaths of 65 million Chinese. It may have been more. That's who she turned to. Here's what he said. "Socialism must be developed, and the route towards such an end is a democratic revolution which will enable socialist and communist consolidation over a length of time." Now, he was talking about China, of course, but you could apply that very much to the United States of America today. The Communist Party USA, which will have their convention next month in Chicago, here's what they say their stated goal is: to build socialism in the United States based on the revolutionary traditions and struggles. Folks, Marxism is socialism, is communism, and we've got to take the veil off and let people know that we are dealing with a pernicious ideology that is responsible for having killed more people than any other way of thought that's ever existed. We don't need that in the United States of America. We're not having it. And so we need to reclaim our history. We need to reclaim our faith in God, because this is one of the things that's under attack. You know, I tell people all the time that my conservatism comes out of my Christian faith. I believe that every individual is sacred, and that individual liberty is what the government is established to protect. It's not established to protect its own power. It's established to protect our freedom. And it's not established to lord over us. It's established to serve us. And it's not established by elites to control the people. It's established by the people in order for the governmental officials we elect and appoint to serve us. And they've got it completely twisted. And they want us all to become servants of the government, because that's exactly what socialism and communism are. Socialism and communism turn every individual under its control into a slave. That's exactly what happened in Russia. That's exactly what happened in China. That's what happened in Cuba. That's what happened in Vietnam. That's what's happened in Venezuela, except now it's erupted into complete chaos. And I tell you, who better to want and love and commit to freedom than the people in this country whose ancestors were once slaves here? Communism has tried to infiltrate the black community and convince them that collectivism is the way. But I'm here to tell you that there is no way to lift a group. Individuals have to lift themselves. And they do that by their own values and their own initiative and their own hard work. And instead of buying into collectivism, which is being sold us, people need to buy into individual initiative and personal responsibility and determination to do what Nelson suggested. Take advantage of what people coming into this country do when they've left a place where they haven't had no freedom. Come into this country and look at it in awe and wonder and say, wow, I can do pretty much anything I want to do here and pretty much be anybody I want to be here. And whether the left will admit it or not, that is true for every black child, every Hispanic child, every Asian child in this nation. They can do whatever they want to do if we'll just take the blinders off and help them to see the opportunities that lie before them. And those opportunities. I'll say one last quick thing. And this is one of the things I hate about this lurch toward the left. I joined the United States Marine Corps in 1970. Hoorah! 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 Semper Fi. And raised my hand and took an oath to the Constitution of the United States. I love that flag because it represents us, who we are and what we stand for. It's a unifying symbol. I love that national anthem because it represents us and who we are and what we stand for. It's a unifying symbol. And this leftist, Marxist, communist, socialist ideology that is creeping into our country is trying to teach our children to disrespect the flag, to dishonor the national anthem, to dishonor our country. But somebody said it to me when we were walking in. If I have to be the last person in this nation standing up for that flag and that national anthem and our Constitution and the freedom and liberty that we enjoy in this nation, I will do it until I breathe my dying breath. But I will never turn this nation over to a bunch of communists and socialists and Marxists to take it down. And I trust you'll stand with me. Is this. We are being asked to allow people to leave this country who have no affection for it. I mean, think about this. Think of the last time you heard a Democrat, you heard a leftist speak affectionately about America. When was the last time you heard it? You don't hear it. You know what you hear? You hear, yes, maybe JFK. You know what you hear? You hear from Andrew Cuomo, it was never that great. And you hear the same thing from Pete Buttigieg. And you hear people associate the flag with being a Republican or being conservative. That flag has no party. It has no race. It represents all of us. And they're asking us to choose those people to lead us over an individual who, although like you and me, is imperfect, loves this country, loves our people, believes in our Constitution, believes in individual liberty, believes in the free market, believes in our Judeo-Christian values, and is doing everything he can to protect our First and Second Amendment and all of our constitutional rights, and that is Donald Trump, and I'll pick him any day of the week and Christ on Sunday over one of these leftists and Marxist comments. I want to bring the speakers back up for questions that you might have of them. Bob covered the First Amendment. Diana West talked about the deep state. Jerome talked about what's going on with this whole communist movement in more broad terms. Nelson actually lived in Cuba. And of course, Trevor talked about his long years of research. So, and I just tried to talk. So if you have any questions, thank you. If you have any questions for us, please feel free. If you want one person to answer it, we'll direct the question toward that person. Yes, sir.
This is for anyone who would like to answer. Before the Vietnam War, Americans opposed communism as a whole, and they feared communism. Since then, the label communism has lost traction. If you say that Bernie Sanders is a communist, that's not going to get much reaction from many of the people. It just seems to be no response to this, and I'm wondering how to break through that. You talk about tearing the blinders off. How do you get to that?
Well, I think this is a start. I think this is a start, pointing out what it really is. And this is, by the way, the beginning of a movement. This is just a one-time deal. Stand Against Communism is an ongoing effort, and we're developing a strategy for addressing this, particularly over the next 2 years leading up to 2020. So that's a very good question, but and you're right, but that's why we chose Stand Against Communism, because we want to point out that it is evil. Yes, ma'am.
So I applaud that, and I thank God for that, but does part of that strategy involve elementary, secondary schools? Because you can just watch, James G. Martin Center just wrote a fabulous paper about what they're doing in the schools of education and how that's where it all starts, and that is the caliber that we're getting, and I'm running for the school board. I'm fighting against a school board who is basing its decisions on these very policies. And this is nothing new. This is 20 years. I grew up in Fairfax County. I went to those schools, and parents say to me when I door knock, what has happened? We just moved here from, pick a state. This is not what we were expecting. And we have got to start at the lowest levels, and we've got to go to the textbooks. We've got to go to the schools of education. Fairfax County needs to be saying, wait a minute, this is not right what you're giving us.
Yeah, I think, if we change everything, there's a massive Marxist infiltration of this country in virtually every aspect. And if we do not address education,
Yes.
everything else is lost, because we are losing our youth. Well, look, America had the very best public education system in the world for 200 years. I would say that the poorest black kid in the poorest school district in Alabama in 1952 got a better education in the basics than the richest white kid in the richest district in Virginia would get today. So what is the change? The change was you had the Department of Education brought in under Carter, which centralized control of education all over the country. Several Republican presidents have promised to abolish the Department of Education over the years. I think we need to put that back on the agenda very strongly. All education goes back to the states. Because we will lose if we don't do that. And I think it's a critical step. You know, if you want to control the future of the nation, control the young minds of the nation.
And one of the people in our group is Roland Smith. I don't know whether yes, Roland Smith is with us, and he's brought that issue up on our calls. So maybe we need to get you involved in that. Yes, sir.
E.W., I just want to know when you're going to announce for president.
Next question. My wife is here. Yes, sir.
Do you think we need, or we could find a few deplorable billionaires to set up a liberty media platform so that we can have some alternative, since our voices are being eliminated from YouTube, from all the social media, TV networks? I mean, what can we do about that? We need a platform. We can't continue to see our voices.
Well, you're sitting right beside Tom McDevitt, chairman of the Washington Times, and he probably knows some of those people. Look, that's something we talked about as well.
And the Epoch Times is becoming a massive national platform now. It's becoming a huge thing out there. So we've got the Washington Times, we've got the Epoch Times. We need to utilize both of those things as much as we possibly can.
Thank you. The Epoch Times is here too.
Yeah,
Yes, yes.
Have you worked
Thank
with
you.
Alex Newman, with the New American? Alex
I know Alex very well. Yeah.
Well, he'll be in Northern Virginia June 4th. It's my event. Y'all need to come.
All right, get us the information. Yes, Tom.
Bishop, Tom McDevitt, chairman of the Washington Times. I really thank God you guys are doing this. I've been involved with Frank Gaffney's committee for the clear and present danger in China, a similar type of effort focused on the China threat. So you mentioned the word strategy. Can you elaborate a little bit? Strategy assumes you have some goals. What does this committee and this group you're putting together see as the key goals to achieve the next, and then from there, flesh out the strategy a little bit?
I won't go too far in fleshing out the strategy, but I'll tell you this.
I have a follow-up question too. So
Okay, but I will tell you this, that we're going to use the spotlight of the presidential election to call attention to what these candidates stand for, who they really are, what their backgrounds are. Because we know that the media is going to be paying attention. They won't like what we're bringing out, but we're going to use this opportunity to do that. And we're going to do that early on. And we talked about some of the early states in which we're going to do it because we want to get ahead of this. So we're not waiting until we get into next year. We're starting that process now. We're working with Tea Party groups. Trevor's got vast connections with the Tea Party groups. We're working with Tea Party groups. We're bringing churches involved. I'm getting some churches involved. Nelson, of course, is the chairman of the Virginia Tea Party, so we'll be working with them here in Virginia, and basically kind of having a strike force that is going to both inform the electorate, make sure that people know who these folks are, and two, challenge these candidates and put them on the defensive, put the whole apparatus on the defensive. Because why hasn't anybody challenged Bernie Sanders, or what does socialism mean? Explain that to us. I mean, we know what its history is, and put him on the hot seat. Instead, I mean, he goes and honeymoons at the Soviet Union and goes and visits with Fidel Castro, and he doesn't have to answer to that.
He won't answer.
And yet, President Trump, every little thing he ever said or did is under scrutiny. So we want to put them on the defensive. So that's the strategy in broad strokes. You said you had a follow-up?
Question about ideology. I was involved during the Cold War with an effort that was a critique and counter-proposal to Marxism-Leninism. Systematically, it's like 13 or 14 presentations from a God-centered point of view, atheism versus Godism. Are you thinking about that? I mean, just the presentations of your committee today, if you bottled that up and distilled it, you have the makings of a framework of a counter-proposal. I don't see that happening so much. You have the biblical worldview folks who are looking at things more from an evangelical standpoint, but from the political, social, cultural implications of this ideological war we're fighting. I think there's a need for that. And
I agree.
my colleagues and I had, that's when the Washington Times was founded, a parallel effort. It was a very thorough. We educated 70,000 pastors. I'd love to be part of that. I think that's what's needed. It's strategic communications, messaging in the 21st century context, that basically takes apart the whole socialist seduction.
Well, I know how busy your schedule is. We have a conference call every Thursday at 1 p.m. And I'm gonna make sure I send you the information. I'd love to have you join it, and so we can talk about these things. But these scholars who are writing about this stuff, I mean, I would imagine they're the ones who would be thinking about some sort of systematic critique of this new ideology that's taking the country by storm, and why American thinking about freedom and free markets and individual liberty are far superior in terms of the results that they produce. So good.
Two other quick things. The Washington Times has 8 million online readers. That's 18,000 plus in every congressional district. Second is approaching things from a train-the-trainer standpoint. Imagine if you bottled up what you guys spoke about today into a couple presentations that pastors could give, or that local leaders could give, and you have 10,000 people telling the story with your credentials and background. I highly recommend those types of approaches, a train-the-trainer approach.
Yeah, I think that's what we
It's
want to do, because
warfare.
yeah, because we can't be in every state, every precinct, so that's exactly what we want to do. Any others? Yes, sir.
Do you see this more of an internal threat or an external threat? Where is this coming from?
Well, I would say, for me, both, but Trevor, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think Diana.
And Diana?
Look, we all know that Bishop Jackson took an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And we have been very keen to fight the foreign enemies for a long time. And every war America gets into is undermined by its domestic enemies. So, and that has been off limits for a very long time. Since the 50s or 60s, you're not allowed to talk about internal enemies. They dismantled the House Un-American Activities Committee, so the internal enemies have had free reign for a very long time. So I think this is primarily an internal enemy threat. If we can deal with that, the external enemies will fall into line pretty quickly.
Folks, we only have until 11, and that's now, so I'll take one more, and then we can take questions afterwards. Maybe we may have to spill out into the hallway. They may kick us out. Yes, sir.
Bishop Jackson, tremendous event. I'm very impressed. My name is Cliff Kincaid. I've been planning for many decades with Trevor, Bob Knight, Jerry Corsi, and others. But with all due respect, I was afraid it would happen at the end, become a re-elect Trump rally here. And I've gotta ask you, admitting that Russiagate was a fraud and hoax, we still have to admit, don't we, that President Trump had some very disturbing contacts with Russia. After all, he was trying to start a Trump Tower in Russia. And don't we have to admit that if we're gonna fight an ideological war, doesn't it make it difficult when you've got a president like Donald Trump doing business with Kim Jong-un and praising this bloody dictator? And who is putting on a welcome mat to communist Vietnam?
All right,
And
well, listen.
just a minute, who is backing a socialist in Venezuela, Juan Guaido, as an alternative to another socialist, and who, President Trump, didn't lift a finger for this Trump supporter right here, who has been through hell telling the truth about the enemies you exposed today.
Okay.
President Trump didn't help this
All right,
man.
I got it, but I would say this to you. This is not heaven. We don't have a choice between Jesus and the other side. We've got a choice between the person we have, and I believe, in spite of what you said, I believe that we are so much better off with him than we ever would have been with Hillary Clinton. what you're saying, but look, I'll tell you something. These folks have some stories about what these Democrats have been doing that would make your hair stand on end. And whatever we might say, I believe, and we got to end it here, I believe that President Trump loves this country, would never betray this nation, would never betray the American people. I believe his heart is in the right place. He's not perfect, like you and I are not perfect, but thank God he's a whole lot better than what the alternative would have been. Thank you all for coming. God bless you.